The church was nearly empty when I heard Ethan's footsteps echoing back down the aisle. Everyone else had already left St. Margaret's after Isabella's baptism. Simone had taken the baby out to the car to change her diaper, and the rest of our guests had headed straight to the reception at my hotel. But something in my gut told me to stay. After 58 years on this earth, 33 of them building a hotel empire from nothing, I'd learned to trust that instinct. It had never steered me wrong in business, and that morning it was screaming at me that something wasn't right. So I'd pretended to pray, kneeling in the last pew with my head bowed and my eyes closed, while everyone filed out around me. The same church where Richard and I had married 3 decades ago. The same altar where we'd baptized Ethan 32 years before. The same wooden pews where I'd sat 3 years ago, numb and hollow, listening to the priest deliver my husband's eulogy. This place held every significant moment of my life, and now it was about to hold one more, though I didn't know it yet. I kept my breathing slow and steady, perfectly still, as Ethan's expensive leather shoes clicked against the marble floor. He walked past me without noticing, his footsteps heavy in a way I'd never heard before. My son had always moved with confidence, that easy athletic grace of someone who'd never known real struggle. But these footsteps were different. They were the steps of a man carrying something unbearably heavy. He stopped at the altar. I heard him drop to his knees, heard the rustle of his suit pants against the cushioned kneeler. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. My son was crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears he'd shed at his father's funeral. These were deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep in his chest. "God, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep lying." Every muscle in my body tensed. I remained perfectly still, hidden in the shadows of the back pew, barely breathing. Something told me I needed to hear this. Something told me that whatever came next would change everything. "Forgive me," Ethan continued, his words tumbling out between sobs. "Forgive me for being such a coward. Forgive me for 13 years of lies. 13 years, God. I was 19 years old when I found out, and I've been lying every single day since." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, but he kept talking, lost in his confession, believing he was alone with God. "I know I'm not his son," Ethan said, and my entire world tilted sideways. "I know the truth. Aunt Maggie left me a letter when she died. She told me everything, about Mom's affair, about how Dad wasn't really my father, about how he knew, how he'd always known, and how he chose to love me anyway." I couldn't breathe. The words made no sense. An affair? What affair? Richard knew what? My mind was racing, scrambling through memories, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. But Ethan wasn't finished. "I confronted him," my son continued, his voice raw with pain. 3 days before he died, while he was in that hospital bed, I showed him Aunt Maggie's letter, and I asked him if it was true. And you know what he did, God? He cried. My father, my dad, the only dad I've ever known, he cried and he told me yes, it was all true. He said Mom had a brief affair 33 years ago when they were going through a rough patch. She got pregnant, came back to him, and they reconciled. She thought I was his. She never knew that he'd figured it out. The rough patch. Oh God, I remembered the rough patch. 1992. Richard had lost a huge chunk of our savings in a bad investment, and we'd been fighting constantly. He'd thrown himself into work, traveling for weeks at a time, leaving me alone to try to save our little bed and breakfast from bankruptcy. I'd felt so abandoned, so desperately alone. And then there'd been that hotel management conference in San Diego. James Mitchell. The name came flooding back after 33 years. He'd been a consultant from Seattle, charming and attentive, and so different from the distant, stressed man my husband had become. We'd talked over drinks after his panel. We'd talked about the industry, about the challenges of keeping small properties afloat, about feeling overwhelmed and underappreciated. And then, in a moment of weakness, I'd regretted the second it was over. I'd made the worst mistake of my life. One night, one single night of betrayal, and then I'd come home, racked with guilt, to find Richard waiting for me with flowers and apologies and a promise that things would be different. We'd reconciled. We'd saved our marriage. 3 weeks later, I discovered I was pregnant with Ethan, and I'd been so happy, so relieved, because our baby had saved us. Our baby had given us something to fight for together. Except he wasn't our baby, not biologically. And apparently, Richard had known. "Dad made me promise," Ethan was saying, his voice thick with tears. "On his deathbed, he made me swear I wouldn't tell her. He said it would destroy Mom to know that he'd carried that secret for 30 years. He said she'd lived her whole life believing a lie, and that knowing the truth would break her. He said he'd loved me like his own son every single day, and that I should let her keep believing that. He said," Ethan's voice broke completely. "He said the secret was his gift to her, his final act of love." I felt tears streaming down my face, hot and silent. Richard. My Richard. He'd known from the beginning, or close to it. He'd known that Ethan wasn't his biological son, and he'd never said a word. He'd held our baby, raised him, loved him, taught him to throw a baseball and drive a stick shift and be a good man. And he'd done it all while carrying the knowledge that I'd betrayed him, that the child wasn't his, that our reconciliation had been built on my lie, a lie I hadn't even known I was telling. "But I'm not protecting her," Ethan continued, his confession pouring out. "I'm not keeping this secret to protect Mom. I'm doing it to protect myself. I'm a coward, God. I'm terrified. What if she stops loving me when she finds out? What if she looks at me differently, knowing I'm not really hers? What if she decides I don't deserve my inheritance, her empire that she built from nothing? I'm her only son, but am I? Legally, morally? Do I have any right to what she's worked for when I'm not even really her child?" "You stupid boy," I wanted to scream. "You absolute fool. You think I carried you for 9 months, nursed you, walked the floor with you through colic and teething and nightmares, paid for your education, held your hand through your father's death? You think any of that was about DNA?" But I stayed silent. I needed to hear it all. "And Simone," Ethan said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "God, Simone. My wife has no idea who she really married. When she wanted to do that genetic testing during her pregnancy to screen for hereditary conditions, I panicked. I told her those companies weren't secure, that they'd sell our data. The truth is, I was terrified of what that test might reveal. What if it showed that Isabella had genetic markers that didn't match what they expected from our family history? What if my lies started unraveling? I thought about Simone, my beautiful daughter-in-law with her warm smile and her genuine kindness. The girl who'd stood by Ethan's side for 4 years, who'd given me my first grandchild, who'd held my hand at Richard's funeral and told me she'd make sure I never felt alone. She deserved better than this. She deserved a husband who trusted her with the truth. Every time Mom mentions DNA tests or genealogy or family history, I shut her down, Ethan continued. Last year, when she wanted to do that whole detailed family tree project, I told her it was a waste of time. When she suggested we all do those Ancestry DNA kits for fun, I said I didn't trust the companies. I've been sabotaging every opportunity for the truth to come out, and she thinks I just don't care about family history. She has no idea that I'm desperate to keep her from discovering that her entire life has been built on a lie she didn't even know she was telling. The pieces were falling into place now. All those little moments over the years when Ethan had reacted with inexplicable irritation to innocent suggestions. The time 2 years ago when I'd mentioned casually that a friend had discovered unexpected heritage through a DNA test, and Ethan had launched into an oddly passionate rant about privacy violations. The time last Christmas when I'd suggested genetic testing for hereditary health conditions that ran in the Hartley family, and he'd changed the subject so abruptly that it had hurt my feelings. I'd attributed it all to stress from work or to some generational difference in values, never imagining the real reason. My son had been living in constant fear, tiptoeing around landmines of his own making for 13 years, since he was 19 years old, since he was barely more than a child himself. And today, Ethan said, his voice breaking again, today, holding Isabella in my arms during her baptism, watching Mom cry tears of joy, seeing how happy she was to have our family together in the same church where she married Dad and baptized me. I couldn't take it anymore. I can't baptize my daughter, my innocent, perfect daughter, on a foundation of lies. I can't start her life with the same deception that's poisoned mine. But I also can't destroy the woman who gave me everything. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this. I'm so tired, God. I'm so tired of lying. The sobs that followed were heartbreaking. My son, my baby, my boy, was breaking apart at the altar of the church where we'd celebrated every major milestone of his life. And I was the only one who could put him back together. I stood up slowly, my knees shaking, but my resolve firm. 33 years of running a successful business had taught me how to be strong when everything inside me wanted to crumble. 30 years of marriage to Richard had taught me about forgiveness and the complicated nature of love. And 32 years of being Ethan's mother had taught me that my son needed me more in this moment than he ever had before. My footsteps on the marble floor made Ethan spin around so fast he nearly fell off the kneeler. His face was red and tear-streaked, his eyes wild with absolute terror. For a moment, he looked exactly like he had as a little boy, the time he'd broken my favorite vase and thought I'd never forgive him. "Mom," he gasped, the word barely audible. How long have you... What did you... I walked down the center aisle slowly, giving him time to compose himself, giving myself time to find the right words. The church was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. When I reached the front pew, I stopped and looked at my son, really looked at him, seeing him with new eyes. Those blue eyes. Richard and I had always wondered where those came from. Richard's eyes had been brown, mine were hazel green. "Must be a recessive gene from somewhere," we'd joked. "Maybe your grandfather's side," I'd said, trying to place them in our family tree. But they weren't from our family tree. They were from James Mitchell's tree, from a man who had no idea he had a son. "I heard everything," I said quietly. My voice was steady, calm, the voice I used in high-stakes business negotiations when I couldn't afford to show emotion. Every single word. Ethan made a sound like he'd been punched. He tried to stand, stumbled, caught himself on the altar rail. His face had gone from red to chalk white. "Mom, please, I can explain. I didn't mean..." 13 years, I said, cutting him off. "You've carried this alone since you were 19 years old, since Aunt Maggie died and left you that letter, since you confronted your father in his hospital bed 3 days before he passed." I paused, letting each statement land. "Your father," because that's what he was, Ethan. DNA doesn't change that. "But I lied to you," Ethan said desperately, tears streaming down his face again. "For 13 years, I lied every single day. I kept this from you. I manipulated situations to keep you from finding out. I'm not who you think I am." I took 3 steps forward and grabbed his face between my hands, the way I used to when he was little, and I needed him to really listen to me. "You listen to me, Ethan Richard Hartley. You are exactly who I think you are. You're the baby I carried for 9 months. You're the child I nursed at 3 in the morning. You're the boy who cried when we had to leave his goldfish behind when we moved. You're the teenager who stayed up all night helping me prep for that huge investor meeting. You're the man who held my hand at your father's funeral and promised me I'd never be alone. That's who you are. A DNA test doesn't change any of that." "But legally," he started. "Legally, you're my son," I said firmly. "Your birth certificate says so. The law says so. And more importantly, love says so. Do you really think I changed your diapers, dealt with your terrible twos, survived your teenage years, and paid for your Yale education because of DNA? I did those things because you're my son, my child, mine." He was crying again, but differently now. These tears were the release of 13 years of pressure, 13 years of fear, 13 years of believing that love was conditional on biology. "I need to know the whole story," I said, gentler now. "I need you to tell me everything. The letter from Maggie, the conversation with your father, all of it. And then we need to talk about what happens next, because we are going to fix this, Ethan, together." He nodded, unable to speak, and I pulled him into my arms the way I had 1,000 times before. He collapsed against me, this grown man who stood 6 inches taller than me and sobbed like a child. I held him and stroked his hair and whispered that everything would be okay, the same words I'd been saying to him since he was born. And in that moment, in that beautiful old church full of memories and secrets and hard truths, I realized something profound. Richard had thought he was protecting me by keeping this secret. Ethan had thought he was protecting himself by continuing the lie. But secrets don't protect anyone. They poison everything they touch. They turn love into fear and truth into landmines. If we were going to move forward, if we were going to heal as a family, we needed to face this truth head on. We needed to excavate 33 years of buried history. We needed to talk about things that would hurt, about betrayals and lies and difficult choices made by people who thought they were doing the right thing. But first, we needed to sit down right here in this church, in this sacred space where our family had celebrated so many milestones, and I needed to hear my son's story from beginning to end. I needed to understand exactly what Richard had carried alone all those years. I needed to know what Maggie had written in that letter. And I needed to figure out who James Mitchell was and whether he deserved to know he had a son. "Come on," I said gently, guiding Ethan to sit in the front pew. "Start from the beginning. Tell me about Maggie's letter." Ethan sat beside me in that front pew, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. "I still have it," he said quietly. "I photographed the letter before I confronted Dad. I couldn't bring myself to keep the original, but I couldn't destroy it either." He handed me the phone, and I stared at my sister's handwriting. Maggie. God, I missed her. She died of ovarian cancer 13 years ago, just 2 months after her diagnosis. Fast and brutal, the way she'd lived her life, no patience for drawn-out anything. I remembered sitting by her hospital bed in those final days, holding her hand, telling her I loved her. And all that time, she'd been carrying this secret, planning to drop this bomb on my son after she was gone. The letter was dated 3 days before she died. "My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry for that, kiddo. I'm sorry I won't be there to help you process what I'm about to tell you. But I can't take this to my grave. Your mother is my baby sister, and I love her more than anything in this world. But she deserves to know the truth about her life, and you deserve to know the truth about yours. In 1992, your parents went through a terrible rough patch. Your dad had made some bad investments and lost a lot of money. They fought constantly. He buried himself in work and travel, and your mom felt abandoned and overwhelmed, trying to save their struggling bed and breakfast. In May of that year, she attended a hotel management conference in San Diego. She met a man there, a consultant named James Mitchell from Seattle. One night of weakness, one mistake she regretted immediately. She came home, Richard apologized for neglecting her, they reconciled. 3 weeks later, she found out she was pregnant with you. She genuinely believed you were Richard's son. But Richard figured it out. I don't know exactly when, maybe during the pregnancy, maybe after you were born. But he knew, and he never told her. He loved you like his own from day one, raised you beautifully, and kept this secret to protect her from the guilt and pain. I kept it too, because he asked me to. But I'm dying now, and I realize that secrets like this are poison. They corrupt everything they touch. You deserve to know where you came from. Your mother deserves to know the full truth of her marriage. And maybe someday, James Mitchell deserves to know he has a son. I'm sorry to burden you with this, sweetheart, but the truth is always better than a lie, even when it hurts. Love always, Aunt Maggie. I read it 3 times, my vision blurring with tears. That was so typically Maggie, blunt, honest to a fault, convinced that truth was always the right choice, no matter the consequences. She'd been my protector our whole lives, 5 years older and fiercely loyal. When our parents died and left us that little bed and breakfast in Laguna Beach, she'd been the one who convinced me I could turn it into something more. She'd been my maid of honor at my wedding. She'd been in the delivery room when Ethan was born. And apparently she'd known this whole time that my son wasn't my husband's biological child. When did you get this? I asked, handing the phone back. The day after her funeral, Ethan said. Her lawyer gave me a sealed envelope marked private, along with a small inheritance she'd left me. $5,000 for college expenses, and this letter that changed my entire life. He stared at the phone screen. I was 19, Mom, 19 years old, starting my sophomore year at Yale, and suddenly everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie. What did you do? I fell apart, he admitted. I holed up in my dorm room for 3 days, didn't go to classes, didn't answer calls. My roommate finally threatened to call you, so I pulled myself together enough to pretend everything was fine. But I wasn't fine. I kept reading that letter over and over, looking at myself in the mirror, trying to figure out if I could see it. If there was something about me that didn't match you and Dad. I thought about those eyes again, those piercing blue eyes that had always seemed like such a beautiful mystery. I almost told you a dozen times, Ethan continued. That Thanksgiving, I had the letter in my pocket when I came home. I was going to sit you down and just show you. But then Dad carved the turkey and made that stupid joke about teaching me to carve when I was 8, and you laughed and you both looked so happy. I couldn't do it. I couldn't destroy that. So you kept it to yourself. For 3 years, he nodded. 3 years of carrying it alone, 3 years of feeling like a fraud every time you introduced me as your son, every time Dad and I did something together. And then, his voice broke. Then Dad had his heart attack. I remembered that day like it was yesterday. Richard had been playing golf with his brother. He'd collapsed on the 7th hole. By the time I got to the hospital, they'd already done emergency surgery. The doctors said the damage was extensive. They gave him maybe a week. I visited him every day for those 5 days, Ethan said. You were there most of the time, but there were moments when you'd go home to shower or eat or try to sleep. And on the 3rd day, when you went home to get some rest because you'd been there for 20 straight hours, I showed him the letter. I closed my eyes, imagining that scene. My husband, dying in a hospital bed, being confronted with a secret he'd kept for 3 decades. What did he say? He cried, Ethan said simply. I'd never seen Dad cry like that, not even when Grandpa died. He took the letter, read it, and just broke down. And then he told me everything. Ethan's voice was thick with emotion. He said he'd figured it out when you were about 6 months pregnant. You'd mentioned something about your dates being off, about the baby possibly being conceived earlier than you'd thought. He did the math and realized it lined up with that conference in San Diego. He said he'd noticed you'd been different when you came back from that trip, guilty, withdrawn. And he knew he'd been a terrible husband during that period, knew he'd driven you to it. He forgave me, I whispered, even though I never asked for forgiveness because I never told him. He said forgiving you was the easiest thing he'd ever done, Ethan continued. He said he loved you, that the affair was his fault as much as yours, that you'd come back to him and chosen your marriage. He said he decided that day to love me as his own son, to never let biology matter. And he did, Mom. He was an incredible father. He never once treated me like I wasn't his. Tears were streaming down my face. Richard. My complicated, wonderful, flawed, loving Richard. He'd carried this burden for 30 years and never let it touch me or Ethan. He made me promise not to tell you, Ethan said. He was so insistent about it. He said you'd lived your whole life believing that your mistake hadn't had consequences, that your marriage had survived intact, that your family was exactly what you thought it was. He said knowing the truth would destroy you, that you'd torture yourself with guilt, that you'd feel like your entire marriage had been a lie, that you'd question whether he'd really loved you or just tolerated you out of pity. That's ridiculous, I said sharply. Richard knew me better than that. Did he? Ethan asked gently. Because I've watched you for 13 years, Mom. I've seen how you've kept Dad on a pedestal since he died, how you talk about your marriage like it was perfect, like he was perfect. Would you really have been okay knowing that your perfect marriage was built on his silent forgiveness of your betrayal? That he knew about my real father for 30 years and never said a word? I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it, because he was right. I had idealized Richard since his death. The marriage that had actually been complicated and real and full of normal ups and downs had become a perfect fairy tale in my memory. And yes, knowing that Richard had carried this secret would have tainted that, would have made me question everything. He also made me promise for my sake, Ethan added. He said that if you knew, you'd look at me differently, that you'd feel guilty every time you looked at me, seeing your mistake instead of your son, that our relationship would be poisoned by the knowledge of how I was conceived. He thought he was protecting both of us by asking me to keep the secret. And you've been protecting yourself by continuing to keep it, I said. Ethan nodded miserably. At first, I kept it because Dad asked me to, because he died 2 days after that conversation, and honoring his dying wish seemed important. But as time went on, I started keeping it for selfish reasons, because I was afraid of losing you, afraid of losing my inheritance, afraid that if you knew the truth, everything would change. Everything has changed anyway, I pointed out. You've been living with this fear for 13 years. It's been eating you alive, Ethan. I've watched you pull away from me, become defensive when I mention anything related to family history or genetics. I've felt the distance between us grow, and I couldn't understand why. I know, he whispered. And it got so much worse after Isabella was born. When Simone was pregnant and wanted to do genetic testing, I panicked. What if the tests revealed something that didn't match our supposed family medical history? What if you noticed that Isabella's genetic markers didn't line up with what you'd expect? I've been living in constant fear that one innocent DNA test would unravel everything. I thought about all the times in recent years when I'd suggested genetic testing, genealogy projects, ancestry research, simple things that most families did without a second thought. And each time, Ethan had shut me down with barely concealed panic that I'd mistaken for disinterest. Tell me about James Mitchell, I said. Do you know anything about him? Ethan shook his head. Just what was in Aunt Maggie's letter. A hotel consultant from Seattle. That's all I have. I thought about trying to find him 1,000 times, but I was too scared. What if he didn't want to know? What if he had a family and I destroyed that? Or what if he did want to know, and then you'd find out about all of this? We're going to find him, I said decisively. We're going to track down James Mitchell, and we're going to figure out what to do about this situation. Together. Mom, are you sure? We could just leave it alone. Keep things the way they are. No, I said firmly. We can't. Because the way they are is built on lies and fear and secrets that are destroying you from the inside out. Your aunt was right about one thing. Secrets are poison. They've poisoned enough already. We left the church an hour later. The reception at my hotel was still going strong. I could hear the noise and laughter as we walked through the lobby toward my private office on the 2nd floor. Simone had texted twice asking where we were, and I'd responded that Ethan and I needed to handle some urgent business matters. It wasn't entirely a lie. This was urgent, and it was definitely a matter that needed handling. My office overlooked the Pacific Ocean. I designed this space myself 15 years ago when I'd renovated this property, my flagship hotel, the crown jewel of the 5 boutique hotels I owned along the California coast. Floor-to-ceiling windows, elegant but comfortable furniture, and walls lined with photos documenting my journey from that tiny bed and breakfast in Laguna Beach to this $12 million empire. Photos of Richard and me cutting ribbons at grand openings. Photos of Ethan as a child, teenager, young man, always at my side during important moments. Photos of our family, 3 people who'd loved each other deeply and built a life together that looked perfect from the outside. Except it hadn't been perfect. It had been complicated and messy and full of secrets that nobody talked about. "Sit," I told Ethan, gesturing to the leather couch while I moved to my desk and opened my laptop. "We're going to find James Mitchell right now." "Mom, maybe we should think about this," Ethan said nervously. "Maybe we should take some time to process everything before we—" "We've taken 13 years, I interrupted. "That's enough time. I need to know who this man is. I need to see his face, and then we'll decide what to do next." I pulled up Google and typed in James Mitchell Hotel Consultant Seattle. Too many results. I added 1992 to the search. Still too broad. I tried different combinations, feeling frustration build. This was like looking for a needle in a haystack 33 years after the needle had been dropped. "Wait," Ethan said, pulling out his phone again. Aunt Maggie mentioned he presented at a panel. If it was a hotel management conference in San Diego in May 1992, there might be records, conference programs, speaker lists, something. Smart kid, my kid. I felt a fierce surge of pride despite everything. We spent the next hour searching, cross-referencing, following digital breadcrumbs. The Hotel Management Association of America had archived conference programs going back decades. We found the San Diego conference from May 15–18, 1992. There, listed as a speaker on a panel about innovative revenue management strategies for independent properties, was James R. Mitchell, Principal Consultant, Mitchell Hospitality Group, Seattle, Washington. "Got you," I whispered. Finding his current information was harder. Mitchell Hospitality Group had apparently dissolved in 2005, but I had resources that most people didn't. I called my attorney, David Chen, who'd been handling my business affairs for 20 years. I didn't care that it was Sunday afternoon, and Isabella's baptism reception was still happening downstairs. This couldn't wait. "David, I need you to find someone for me," I said when he answered. James R. Mitchell was running a consulting business in Seattle in the 90s. "I need a current address, phone number, any information you can get, and I need it fast." "Vivienne, it's Sunday," David said, but his tone was already shifting into work mode. He knew that when I used that tone, it was serious. "Can this wait until tomorrow?" "No," I said flatly. "I'll pay triple your usual rate. I need this information by tonight." To his credit, David didn't ask questions. "I'll see what I can do." While we waited, Ethan and I sat in uncomfortable silence. I could see him struggling with whether to say something, his mouth opening and closing several times before he finally spoke. "Mom, what are you going to do when we find him?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I need to see him. I need to understand who he is, what his life looks like, and then we'll figure out if he deserves to know he has a son." "What if he doesn't want to know? What if he's married, has other kids, and I'm just some mistake from 33 years ago that would ruin his life?" I turned to look at my son, really look at him. "You are not a mistake, Ethan. You were never a mistake. Yes, the circumstances of your conception were complicated. But you? You've been the greatest gift of my life since the moment I knew you existed. Even though I'm not Richard's biological son? Especially because of how Richard chose to love you anyway," I said firmly. "Do you know how much strength that took? How much character? Your father was an extraordinary man, Ethan. And yes, I'm angry that he kept this from me. I'm furious that he let me live in ignorance for 30 years. But I also understand why he did it. He was trying to protect our family. He just didn't realize that secrets don't protect, they poison." My phone rang. David, calling back in less than 2 hours. Efficient as always. "I found him," David said. "James Russell Mitchell. currently 64 years old, living in Ashland, Oregon, retired in 2015 after selling his consulting business. Married to Patricia Mitchell for 42 years. 2 adult children, Jennifer, 39, and Michael, 36. 6 grandchildren. Clean financial records, no criminal history, fairly active in his community. I'm emailing you his current address and phone number now. 42 years. James Mitchell had been married for 42 years, which meant he'd been married for 9 years when he'd slept with me at that conference. He'd cheated on his wife, gone home to his family, and apparently never looked back. He had 2 other children, children who were older than Ethan, children he'd raised and known about, and he had no idea that somewhere in California he had a 32-year-old son. "Thank you, David," I said. "Send me your bill." I hung up and looked at Ethan. He's in Oregon, retired, married for 42 years with 2 adult children and 6 grandchildren. Ethan's face went pale. He was married when you two... "Yes," I said quietly. He was married. We were both married. We both made terrible choices that night. I paused. His other children are older than you. Jennifer is 39, Michael is 36, so he had a family he went home to. "Do you think his wife knows?" Ethan asked. "About the affair?" "I have no idea. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they had an understanding, maybe they worked through it, maybe she never found out." I pulled up Google Images and searched for James Mitchell and Ashland, Oregon. Several results came up. Pictures from community events, a local newspaper article about his retirement, a photo from some charity golf tournament. And there he was. Older now, his hair silver white, but the bone structure was the same. The nose, the jawline, and those eyes. Those distinctive blue eyes that I'd wondered about for 32 years every time I looked at my son. Ethan leaned over my shoulder and sucked in a sharp breath. Oh my God, I looked just like him. He did. The resemblance was undeniable once you knew to look for it. Same eyes, same facial structure, same way of holding his head slightly tilted when he smiled. How had I never noticed? How had Richard lived with seeing those features on his son's face every day, knowing where they came from, and never let it show? "We need to tell Simone," I said suddenly. "Before we do anything else, your wife needs to know the truth." "Mom, no, I can't." "Yes, you can," I interrupted firmly. "You're going to tell her tonight, before she hears it from someone else or figures it out on her own. She's your wife, Ethan. She deserves honesty. And if this marriage is going to survive what comes next, it needs to be built on truth, not more secrets." Ethan looked terrified, but he nodded slowly. "Okay, tonight, after Isabella's asleep." "Good," I said. "And tomorrow, I'm going to Oregon." "What? Mom, you can't just show up at his house." "I'm not going to show up at his house," I said. "I'm going to call him first. I'm going to invite him to meet me in a neutral location. And I'm going to tell him the truth." I looked at Ethan steadily. "You can come with me if you want, or you can stay here. But I'm doing this, with or without your blessing." We went back downstairs to the reception. I put on my hostess smile and worked the room, accepting congratulations on Isabella's baptism, making small talk with guests, playing the role of proud grandmother and successful businesswoman. But my mind was elsewhere, already planning the conversation I'd have with James Mitchell. Simone found me near the dessert table. "Vivienne, is everything okay? You and Ethan disappeared for hours." "We had some family business to discuss," I said, squeezing her hand. "Nothing for you to worry about right now. Enjoy the party. But tonight, after Isabella's in bed, Ethan needs to talk to you about something important." Her eyes widened with concern. "Is he okay? Are you okay?" "We will be," I said, hoping it was true. "Just trust me, sweetheart. Trust that everything we're doing is to make this family stronger." The party finally wound down around 6 in the evening. Guests trickled out, thanking me for a lovely celebration, completely unaware that the family they were celebrating had just imploded and was trying to reconstruct itself from the pieces. I walked through the ballroom after everyone left, looking at the decorations, white and pink balloons, elegant floral arrangements, a beautiful cake that read, "Blessed is Isabella." My granddaughter's baptism, what should have been a pure celebration of family and faith, had become the catalyst for the truth finally emerging. I went home to my house on the cliff, the home Richard and I had bought 20 years ago when the hotels started generating serious money. 6 bedrooms, ocean views from every window, decorated with impeccable taste and filled with memories. I walked through rooms that suddenly felt hollow, looking at photos of my life with new understanding. There was Richard and me on our wedding day, both of us so young and full of hope. There we were cutting the ribbon at my second hotel opening, both of us beaming. There was the 3 of us, Richard, Ethan, and me, at Ethan's high school graduation. Richard's hand on Ethan's shoulder, so much pride in his face, pride in raising a son who wasn't biologically his, pride in choosing love over ego, pride in keeping a secret that he thought protected his family. I poured myself a glass of wine, a very expensive Pinot Noir from a winery Richard and I had visited on our 25th anniversary, and sat on my terrace watching the sun set over the Pacific. Tomorrow, I would call James Mitchell. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of unraveling 33 years of hidden truth. But tonight, I needed to grieve. Grieve for the marriage I thought I'd had. Grieve for the husband who'd loved me enough to forgive a betrayal I didn't even remember clearly. Grieve for my son who'd lost his innocence at 19 and had been living in fear ever since. Grieve for the simple, uncomplicated family history I'd believed in, which turned out to be anything but simple. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. Told Simone everything. She's processing. She's angry I kept it from her, but says she still loves me. She wants to meet with you tomorrow before you call James Mitchell. I texted back, "Come for breakfast, 9 a.m. Bring Isabella. We'll figure this out together." Then another text, this one from David Chen. "Vivian, I don't know what this is about, but I want you to know I'm here if you need legal advice on whatever you're dealing with. Call anytime. Dear David, always looking out for me." I responded, "Thank you. I may need help navigating some family complications in the coming weeks. I'll keep you posted." I sat there until the sun disappeared completely and the stars came out. The same stars that had been shining the night I'd made my mistake with James Mitchell 33 years ago. The same stars that had been shining the night Richard had figured out the truth but chosen silence. The same stars that had been shining every night for the past 13 years while Ethan carried his burden alone. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations. James Mitchell would learn he had a son he never knew existed. His family would be shaken. Ethan would have to face his biological father for the first time. And I would have to figure out how to rebuild trust and honesty in a family that had been built on well-intentioned lies. But tonight, I just sat with the weight of it all. With the complicated truth that love isn't always enough, that forgiveness doesn't erase betrayal, that secrets have a way of festering until they poison everything they touch. And that sometimes the people who love us most make the worst decisions trying to protect us from pain. Richard had tried to protect me by keeping his knowledge secret. Ethan had tried to protect himself by continuing the lie. And I had tried to protect my marriage by burying my guilt so deep I'd almost convinced myself it had never happened. We'd all failed. We'd all contributed to this mess. But maybe, just maybe, we could also be the ones to clean it up. Maybe honesty, no matter how painful, could be the foundation for something stronger than what we'd had before. Maybe facing James Mitchell, acknowledging the truth, and building a new family structure based on reality instead of fantasy could give us all the freedom we needed to move forward. I finished my wine and went inside. Tomorrow was coming whether I was ready or not, and I'd learned over 58 years on this earth that when difficult things needed doing, the only way through was forward. I texted Ethan one more time. I'm proud of you for telling Simone. That took courage. Sleep well. Tomorrow we start fixing this together. His response came immediately. I love you, Mom. Thank you for not hating me. I felt tears prick my eyes again. I could never hate you. You're my son. Nothing will ever change that. Not DNA, not secrets, not anything. Sleep well, my boy. I went to bed but didn't sleep much. My mind kept replaying that conference in San Diego, trying to remember details I'd buried for 33 years. James Mitchell had been charming, attentive, easy to talk to. We'd connected over shared frustrations in the industry, over feeling underappreciated by spouses who didn't understand the pressure we were under. It had felt innocent at first, just two colleagues having drinks, networking, commiserating. But then he'd walked me back to my hotel room, and I'd invited him in. And we'd made a choice that had consequences neither of us could have imagined. One night. One stupid, selfish, lonely night. And here we were, 3 decades later, about to blow up multiple families because of it. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m, exhausted emotionally and physically. And I dreamed of Richard, standing in our bedroom the way he used to, smiling at me with that gentle, knowing expression he'd always had. In the dream, he said, "It's okay, Viv. It was always okay. I loved you both so much. Don't be angry at me for keeping the secret." I did what I thought was right. When I woke up at 7, my pillow was wet with tears. Simone arrived at 9 sharp the next morning, looking exhausted but determined. She carried Isabella in her car seat, the baby sleeping peacefully, completely oblivious to the family drama unfolding around her. Ethan trailed behind, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd slept about as well as I had. I'd set breakfast on the terrace, fresh fruit, pastries from my hotel's bakery, strong coffee that we were all going to need. The morning was beautiful, one of those perfect California days with blue sky and gentle ocean breeze, completely at odds with the heaviness we were all feeling. "Thank you for coming," I said, hugging Simone tightly. She held on longer than usual, and I realized she needed reassurance just as much as Ethan did. "I needed to see you," she said quietly. "I needed to hear your side of this before we move forward." We sat down, and for the next hour, I told her everything. My perspective on that rough patch with Richard, the loneliness I'd felt, the conference in San Diego, my moment of weakness with James Mitchell. I told her about coming home to Richard's apology and reconciliation, about discovering my pregnancy 3 weeks later and genuinely believing Ethan was Richard's son. I explained how I'd lived 33 years, never knowing that my husband had figured out the truth, never suspecting that the foundation of my family was different than I'd thought. Simone listened without interrupting, her hand occasionally reaching out to squeeze Ethan's. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not angry," she finally said. "Not at you, Vivian. You didn't know. But I'm angry at Ethan for keeping this from me for the 4 years we've been married. I'm angry that he let me plan genetic testing during my pregnancy and then sabotaged it with lies about privacy concerns. I'm angry that he watched me struggle to understand why he pulled away whenever we talked about family history." "I know," Ethan said miserably. "I'm so sorry, Simone. I was scared and stupid and—" "But I understand why," she continued, cutting him off gently. "I understand being terrified of losing everything. I understand the pressure of carrying a secret like that alone since you were 19. She turned to look at him fully. "What I don't understand is why you didn't trust me enough to help you carry it." "I was afraid you'd leave," he whispered. "Afraid you'd think I wasn't who you thought you married. Ethan, I married you because you're kind and funny and smart and because you cry during sad movies and sing to our daughter at 3 a.m, Simone said firmly. "None of that has anything to do with whose DNA you carry, but our marriage has to be built on honesty. No more secrets. Not about this, not about anything. Can you promise me that?" "I promise," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "No more secrets." Simone turned to me. So you're really going to call James Mitchell today? Yes, I said. I've been thinking about it all night. He deserves to know he has a son. And Ethan deserves the chance to know his biological father, if he wants that. But I also need to be smart about this. We don't know what kind of man he is now, whether he'll welcome this news or reject it completely. What if he's horrible? Simone asked. What if he wants nothing to do with Ethan? Then Ethan will know that his real father, the one who mattered, was Richard, I said simply. Richard chose to love him. James Mitchell contributed DNA, but Richard contributed everything that actually matters. Meeting James doesn't change that. I pulled out my phone and stared at the number David had sent me. James Mitchell's cell phone. One call would change everything. There would be no going back once I made contact. Do you want us to stay while you call him? Ethan asked nervously. I thought about it, then shook my head. No, this first conversation needs to be just between him and me. We need to establish the facts before we involve anyone else, but stay close. I'll tell you everything as soon as we're done. They moved inside with Isabella while I stayed on the terrace, phone in hand, heart pounding. I'd negotiated million-dollar deals without this much anxiety. I'd fired dishonest employees, faced down aggressive competitors, handled crisis after crisis in my business. But this was different. This was personal in a way that nothing else in my life had ever been. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. The phone rang 3 times before a man answered. Hello? That voice. I recognized it even after 33 years. Deeper now, aged, but still carrying that same warm, easy tone that had made him so easy to talk to at that conference. James Mitchell? I said, keeping my voice steady. Yes. Who's calling? My name is Vivian Hartley. You don't know me anymore, but we met a long time ago at a hotel management conference in San Diego, May of 1992. There was a long silence. Then, carefully, I'm sorry. I don't remember. Yes, you do, I said quietly. We spent an evening together. We talked about the pressures of the hospitality industry, about feeling underappreciated. And then we made a mistake that we both regretted. Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, become guarded. What is this about? Why are you calling me after 33 years? Because that mistake had consequences, I said. Consequences that you need to know about. I'm not asking for anything, James. I'm not threatening you. But there's information you deserve to have, and a conversation we need to have in person. Are you willing to meet with me? In person? I don't think... I live in Newport Beach, I interrupted. But I'm willing to come to you. Ashland, Oregon, correct? I can be there tomorrow. I'll meet you wherever you're comfortable. A coffee shop, a park, anywhere public. 1 hour of your time. That's all I'm asking. Does this have something to do with money? He asked suspiciously. Because if you're trying to... I own 5 boutique hotels worth $12 million, I said flatly. I don't need your money, James. I need 1 hour of your time to tell you something important, something that affects both of us. He was quiet again, and I could practically hear him thinking, weighing options, trying to figure out what this could possibly be about. Tomorrow, he finally said. There's a coffee shop called The Broken Leaf on Main Street. 2 o'clock. 1 hour, like you said, and then I'm done with whatever this is. Thank you, I said. I'll be there. I hung up and sat very still, my hands shaking. Tomorrow. Tomorrow I would sit across from James Mitchell and tell him he had a 32-year-old son. Tomorrow, everything would change again. Ethan appeared in the doorway. Mom, did you... I called him, I said. We're meeting tomorrow in Ashland, 2 o'clock. Do you want me to come with you? I thought about it seriously. Not for the initial meeting. I need to tell him alone, gauge his reaction, see what kind of man he is. But if things go well, if he wants to meet you, then yes. We'll arrange that. What if he doesn't want to know? Then we'll deal with that too, I said firmly. But one way or another, tomorrow we start living in the truth, instead of in secrets, and that's worth whatever comes next. I drove to Ashland the next day, leaving at 6 in the morning to make the 10-hour drive. I could have flown, but I needed the time to think, to prepare myself for what I was about to do. The drive up Interstate 5 through California and into Oregon gave me hours to rehearse what I'd say, how I'd explain 33 years of complicated history in a way that wouldn't sound insane. The Broken Leaf was exactly the kind of place I'd expected: cozy, artistic, the sort of independent coffee shop that thrived in college towns like Ashland. I arrived 20 minutes early and ordered a green tea I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands. I chose a table in the back corner where we could talk privately but still be visible to the rest of the cafe. Safe, neutral. At exactly 2 o'clock, James Mitchell walked through the door. He looked older than in the photos I'd found online, more tired. He was wearing jeans and a casual button-down shirt, his silver hair neatly trimmed. And those eyes, those distinctive blue eyes that I'd been looking at on my son's face for 32 years, scanned the cafe until they landed on me. I raised my hand slightly, and he walked over, his expression wary. "Vivienne?" he said, and I nodded. He sat down across from me, not offering to shake hands, his body language defensive. "I have to admit, I've been racking my brain trying to remember you from that conference. It was over 30 years ago. I was using my maiden name then," I said. "Vivienne Sutherland. We were both speakers at the Hotel Management Association conference. You presented on revenue management strategies. I presented on customer experience in small properties." Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or just the effort of trying to remember. "I presented at a lot of conferences back then. I'm sorry, I just don't—" "We had drinks after the second day," I continued quietly. "You told me about your consulting business, about the pressure you felt to keep growing it. I told you about my struggling bed and breakfast, about my husband who'd made bad investments and was never around. We commiserated about feeling alone in our marriages, even though we weren't technically alone." His face paled slightly. "I think, maybe I remember. You had long dark hair. You seemed sad." "I was sad," I admitted, "and lonely. And I made a choice that night that I've regretted for 33 years. We both did." He looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Look, if this is about that night, I'm sorry. I was in a bad place in my marriage too, and I shouldn't have—" "I got pregnant," I said, cutting through his discomfort with the truth. 3 weeks after I got home from that conference, I found out I was pregnant. The color drained completely from his face. "What?" "I didn't know it was yours," I continued, watching his reaction carefully. "My husband and I had reconciled when I got back. We were trying to fix our marriage. When I discovered I was pregnant, I assumed the baby was his. I genuinely believed that for 32 years. 32 years, he repeated slowly. "You're saying you have a 32-year-old, and you think it's mine?" "I don't think. I know." I pulled out my phone and showed him the photo I'd chosen. Ethan at his college graduation, smiling at the camera with those unmistakable blue eyes. "This is my son, Ethan. Look at him, James. Really, look at him." He stared at the photo for a long moment, and I watched the realization dawn on his face. The resemblance was undeniable. "Oh my God," he whispered. "He has my eyes, my face. When did you find out?" "I found out 4 days ago," I said, "at my granddaughter's baptism. My son confessed that he'd known the truth for 13 years, but had been too afraid to tell me. My late husband apparently figured it out shortly after Ethan was born, but kept it secret to protect me from the guilt. Everyone in my life knew the truth, except me." James sat back in his chair, looking like he might be sick. "I don't understand. How did your son know? How did your husband know?" I explained about Maggie's letter, about Ethan confronting Richard on his deathbed, about the 13 years of fear and secrets. I told him about the baptism, about overhearing Ethan's confession in the church, about the decision to track James down and tell him the truth. "My husband died 3 years ago," I said. "He never told me he knew. He raised Ethan as his own son, loved him completely, and took the secret to his grave, or tried to. But secrets have a way of coming out eventually." James was quiet for a long time, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he hadn't touched. "I have 2 other children," he finally said. "Jennifer is 39. Michael is 36. They're both married with kids of their own. And now you're telling me I have another son who's 32 years old, and I never knew he existed?" "Yes," I said simply. "Does he know about me? Does he want to meet me?" "He knows about you. He's seen your photo. He knows you're married, that you have other children, that you built a life in Oregon. Whether he wants to meet you depends on whether you want to meet him." "Want to meet him?" James repeated incredulously. "I don't even know how to process this. You show up after 33 years and tell me I have a son, a grown man with his own life, and I missed all of it? His childhood, his first day of school, teaching him to drive, his graduation, everything?" "Yes," I said again. "You missed all of it. But that wasn't your fault. You didn't know. I didn't tell you because I didn't know myself. But now you do know, and you get to decide what happens next." He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "I need air. I need to think. This is—" He stopped, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Does your son hate me for not being there?" "He doesn't hate you," I said. "How could he? You didn't abandon him. You simply never knew he existed. His father, the man who raised him, was an incredible person who loved him deeply. Ethan had a good childhood, James. He didn't suffer because you weren't there. He had Richard." "But I should have been there," James said, his voice breaking. "If I'd known, God, if I'd known I had another child, what would you have done?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You were married. You had 2 small children at home. Would you have left them? Would you have told your wife? What could you realistically have done?" He sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. I don't know. My wife, Patricia, doesn't know about that night, about any of the times I—" He stopped, looking up at me with guilty eyes. "You weren't the only one. I cheated on my wife multiple times during those years. I was traveling constantly, feeling unappreciated, making terrible choices. We almost divorced in 1995. But we went to counseling. I stopped traveling so much, and we fixed things. We've been happy for almost 30 years now, and now you're telling me that one of those mistakes resulted in a child?" I felt a chill run through me. "One of multiple affairs," I said flatly. "So I wasn't special, just one of several women you slept with while your wife was home with your children." "I'm not proud of it," he said defensively. "I was a different person then. I've spent decades being a better man, being faithful, being the husband Patricia deserved from the beginning." "Good for you," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "You got to redeem yourself and build a happy marriage. Meanwhile, I lived with guilt I didn't even fully understand. My husband died carrying a secret that poisoned him, and my son spent 13 years terrified of losing everything. So forgive me if I'm not impressed by your redemption arc." We sat in tense silence. I hadn't meant to get angry, but hearing him casually mention multiple affairs, as if I'd been just one of many meaningless encounters, had triggered something raw in me. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You're right. I have no right to act like I'm the victim here. You came all this way to tell me something you didn't have to tell me. You could have kept this secret forever, and I never would have known. So why did you tell me?" "Because my son deserves to know his biological father if he wants to," I said. "Because secrets have destroyed enough already, and I'm done with them. And because you deserve to know you have another child in this world, even if you missed his entire childhood. What you do with that information is up to you." James was quiet for a moment. "What's he like? Your son, Ethan." I pulled out my phone and showed him more photos. Ethan as a baby, chubby-cheeked and happy. Ethan at 8 years old, missing his 2 front teeth. Ethan at his high school graduation, tall and handsome in his cap and gown. Ethan at his wedding to Simone, looking at his bride with absolute adoration. And finally, Ethan holding Isabella at her baptism 4 days ago, the same moment before everything had fallen apart. "He's an architect," I said. "He graduated from Yale. He's married to a wonderful woman named Simone, and they have a 3-month-old daughter, Isabella. He's kind and smart and funny. He cries during sad movies and sings off-key to his daughter in the middle of the night. He's everything I could have hoped for in a son." "He looks happy," James said softly, studying the wedding photo. "You did a good job raising him." "His father and I did a good job," I corrected. "Richard deserves most of the credit. He was patient and present and loving in ways that I'm realizing were extraordinary. He knew Ethan wasn't biologically his, and he chose to be his father anyway. That's real parenthood, James. Not DNA. Choice." "I understand," James said, "but DNA still matters, biology still matters, and I've missed 32 years of my son's life. I can't get that back." "No, you can't," I agreed. "But you can decide whether you want to be part of his life going forward. Ethan is here in Oregon with me. He's staying at a hotel in town, waiting to hear how this conversation goes. If you want to meet him, I can arrange that. If you don't, I'll tell him that, and we'll leave you alone." "What about my wife?" James asked. "My other children? This will destroy them. Finding out I had an affair, that I have another son, that's your problem to solve, not mine," I said bluntly. "I'm not asking you to blow up your family. I'm asking if you want to meet your son. What you tell your wife and children is between you and them. But I will tell you this. Secrets always come out eventually. Always. You can control how and when the truth comes out, or you can let it explode at the worst possible moment. Those are your choices." He rubbed his face tiredly. "Can I meet him? Not today. I need time to process this, to figure out what to say to Patricia. But tomorrow? Can I meet him tomorrow?" Relief flooded through me. "Yes, tomorrow. Where and when?" "There's a park near here, Lithia Park. It's quiet, peaceful." 2:00 again? "I'll tell him," I said. "James, one more thing. Ethan is nervous about meeting you. He's afraid you'll reject him, that you'll think he's just a complication you don't need. Please, whatever else happens, be kind to him tomorrow. He didn't ask for any of this." "Neither did I," James said, but his tone had softened. "But you're right. None of this is his fault. I'll be kind. I promise." We stood up to leave, the conversation feeling incomplete but also exhausted. As we walked toward the door, James stopped and turned to me. "Did you love me?" he asked suddenly. "That night in San Diego, was it just physical or did you feel something more?" I thought about how to answer honestly. "I didn't love you. I loved my husband, even when we were struggling. You were kind to me when I felt invisible, and I made a terrible choice because of that kindness. But love? No. I'm sorry if that's harsh, but you asked for the truth." He nodded slowly. "Thank you for being honest. I didn't love you either. I don't think I even knew you. But I'm grateful that our mistake resulted in what sounds like a good man. That has to count for something." "It does," I agreed. "It counts for a lot." I drove back to the hotel where Ethan was waiting, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I'd done it. I'd told James Mitchell the truth, and he hadn't run away. He'd agreed to meet Ethan. Whatever happened next, we'd taken the first step toward building something honest. Ethan was pacing the hotel room when I arrived. "How did it go? What did he say? Does he hate me?" "He doesn't hate you," I said, pulling my son into a hug. "He wants to meet you tomorrow, 2:00 at Lithia Park. He needs to tell his wife first, but he wants to meet you." Ethan pulled back, his eyes wide. "Tomorrow? Already? I don't know if I'm ready." "You're ready," I said firmly. "You've been ready for 13 years. This is your chance to get answers, to understand where you came from. You don't have to build a relationship with him if you don't want to. But you deserve the chance to look your biological father in the eye and see who he really is. Will you come with me? If you want me there, I'll be there, I promised. Every step of the way. The next afternoon, we arrived at Lithia Park 15 minutes early. Ethan was so nervous I could see his hands trembling. I held one of them as we walked down the path toward the meeting spot James had specified, a bench near the Japanese garden, quiet and beautiful, surrounded by trees just beginning to show their autumn colors. James was already there, sitting on the bench with his hands folded in his lap. He stood when he saw us approaching, and I watched my son and his biological father look at each other for the first time. The resemblance was even more striking in person. Same height, same build, same way of standing with weight slightly shifted to the left, same eyes that held the same expression of nervous uncertainty. "Ethan," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Mr. Mitchell," Ethan replied, formal and stiff. "Please, call me James." He gestured to the bench. "Would you like to sit?" I started to step back to give them privacy, but Ethan grabbed my hand. "Stay, Mom, please." So I sat on the bench between them, a bridge between past and present, between mistake and consequence, between two men who shared DNA but nothing else. "I told my wife last night," James said, "about the affair, about you. She was devastated, furious. She threw things. She said she wanted a divorce. But this morning, she said she wanted to meet you. She said that if we were going to deal with this, we needed to deal with it honestly, all of us together." "I don't want to destroy your marriage," Ethan said quickly. "That's not why we—" "You're not destroying anything," James interrupted gently. "I destroyed it 33 years ago when I cheated on her, multiple times. You're just the consequence I never knew about. But Patricia is stronger than I gave her credit for. She said that if you're my son, then you're family, whether we like it or not. She wants to meet you, if you're willing." Ethan looked at me, and I nodded encouragingly. "That's up to you, sweetheart. There's no pressure either way." "I'd like that," Ethan said softly. "I'd like to meet her, and your other children, if they want to meet me." "Jennifer and Michael are struggling with this," James admitted. "Finding out their father cheated, that they have a half-brother they never knew about. It's a lot to process. But they're good people. They'll come around." He paused. "Can I ask you something? About your childhood? Your father, Richard, right? Was he good to you?" "He was the best," Ethan said, and I heard his voice break slightly. "He was patient and kind and present. He taught me everything important. He loved me, James. He really loved me, even knowing I wasn't biologically his. That's the kind of father everyone should have." "I'm glad," James said, and I could see tears in his eyes. "I'm glad you had that, even though it meant I missed out. Richard sounds like he was an extraordinary man." "He was," I said quietly. "He forgave me for something I didn't even remember clearly. He chose love over ego. He protected our family the only way he knew how, even if it meant carrying a terrible secret alone. I'm angry at him for not telling me, but I also understand why he did it." We sat there for an hour, the three of us, talking about everything and nothing. James told stories about his consulting work, his life in Oregon, his grandchildren. Ethan told him about architecture, about Simone, about Isabella. They discovered they both liked the same obscure jazz musicians, both hated Brussels sprouts, both had a habit of organizing books by color instead of author. Small connections. Tiny threads of similarity that meant nothing and everything at the same time. When it was time to leave, James stood and held out his hand to Ethan. But Ethan surprised us both by pulling him into a brief, awkward hug. "Thank you for not rejecting me," Ethan said. "I was so afraid you wouldn't want to know me." "How could I not want to know you?" James said, his voice thick. "You're my son. I missed 32 years. I don't want to miss any more." We exchanged contact information and made plans for Ethan to meet Patricia and James's other children the following month, after everyone had time to process. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was messy and complicated and full of unresolved emotions, but it was honest, and that was what mattered most. The drive home to California took another 10 hours. Ethan and I talked the entire way, processing everything that had happened, everything that had changed in just 5 days since Isabella's baptism. We talked about Richard and the complicated nature of his love, about forgiveness and secrets and the difference between biological and chosen family. "Do you regret it?" Ethan asked somewhere around the Oregon-California border. "The affair with James?" I thought about it carefully. I regret the betrayal of Richard, yes. I regret the pain it caused, even though he never told me about it. But do I regret that it resulted in you? Never. Not for a single second. You've been the greatest joy of my life, Ethan. DNA doesn't change that. "I'm going to get a DNA test," he said. "Official confirmation, you know, just so there's no doubt." "That's smart," I agreed. "No more assumptions, no more secrets." 3 weeks later, the DNA test confirmed what we already knew. James Mitchell was Ethan's biological father with 99.99% certainty. We had the science to back up what the eyes had already told us. 2 months after the baptism, we all gathered for Thanksgiving dinner at my house in Newport Beach. Ethan and Simone with Isabella. James and Patricia, who turned out to be a gracious, steel-spined woman, who decided that if her husband's past mistakes had resulted in another child, she'd at least make sure that child felt welcome. Jennifer and Michael, who were awkward but trying, who looked at their half-brother with curiosity and cautious acceptance. It wasn't perfect. There were uncomfortable silences and forced conversations. Patricia's eyes sometimes went hard when she looked at me, the woman who'd slept with her husband 33 years ago. James's other children kept their distance from Ethan, not quite sure how to fit him into their understanding of family. But we were there. We were trying. We were choosing honesty over comfort, truth over convenient fiction. As I stood in my kitchen, looking out at this strange, blended, broken, rebuilding family gathered on my terrace, I thought about Richard. About how he would have handled this situation if he were still alive. Part of me believed he would have been relieved to have the secret finally out. Part of me believed he would have welcomed James and his family with the same grace he'd shown in raising a son who wasn't biologically his. "He'd be proud of you," Simone said, appearing beside me with Isabella in her arms. "Richard, he'd be proud of how you're handling this." "I don't know about that," I said. "I feel like I'm just stumbling through, making it up as I go." "That's what everyone does," she said wisely. "Nobody has a manual for this situation, but you're choosing love and honesty over anger and secrets. That takes courage." I took Isabella from her arms, looking down at my granddaughter's face. She had Ethan's nose, Simone's mouth, and those distinctive blue Mitchell eyes that had caused so much pain and confusion. But she was perfect. She was the future, and unlike her father, she would grow up knowing the truth of where she came from, all the complicated, messy, beautiful truth. "No more secrets," I whispered to her. "We're done with secrets in this family. From now on, we tell the truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." Isabella grabbed my finger and held on tight, her grip surprisingly strong for such a tiny person. And I realized that was what we were all doing now, holding on tight to each other through the pain and confusion, choosing connection over convenience, choosing family over biology, choosing truth over the comfortable lies we'd all been living. It wasn't the ending I'd expected when I'd gone to that church for Isabella's baptism. It wasn't the story I'd thought I was living for 58 years. But it was real. It was honest. And it was ours. And that, I'd learned, was the only foundation worth building a family on. Not perfect pasts, or hidden truths, or well-intentioned secrets. Just messy, complicated, painful, beautiful honesty. The kind of honesty that said, this is who we are. This is where we came from. This is what we're choosing to do about it. The kind of honesty that, finally, set us all free.